The 80s brought about the birth of the beat-em-up genre, and along the way we saw some games innovated enough where it would gather enough steam to power into the 90s. But what sort of new ideas would we see from the companies? And would the 90s sustain that momentum throughout the full decade? Sit back, grab some popcorn, and let's take a look at a very busy 90s and the beat-em-up genre. The 80s had finished with a bang, so the 90s is starting strong with Combat Tribes from Technos. It was a 3-player cabinet from the same people who had brought you the great Double Dragon 1 and 2 arcades. Very colorful graphics, very solid sound effects, and some of the fighting moves looked great as you pulled them off. It felt like Technos could do no wrong with the fighting genre. This game here also ditched the health bar in place of a number display like some previous brawlers. Spinning enemies around or bashing them in their heads together never felt so great, and the ability to play with 2 others at the same time was just too perfect. You could even throw people down the stairs. The game was well received and it even got a port to the Super NES, but as always, back in those days, if you wanted the full experience, you went to the arcade. But just when you thought that Technos could do no wrong with the beat-em-up games, their next decision would not pan out so great. Double Dragon 3 and the Rosetta Stones. Technos made the baffling decision to hand off their fan-favorite franchise to a third-party company for development, and that company was East Technology. This immediately changed the overall feel of the franchise, as well as it stoked the fire and ire of the fans. This arcade might be one of the earliest examples of a microtransaction in video games. We see them every day in our current life, it's no big deal, but back then, this was a practice unheard of. You could walk into a shop in each level of the game to acquire power-ups or even a free life at the cost of an extra quarter. Back then, games would offer power-ups and free lives depending on game scores and in-game mechanics. Double Dragon 3 took all that aside and decided to charge the fans up front. The overall fighting mechanics were all broken and the difficulty was ramped up to insane levels. Not even the storyline, which was disregarded in the previous 2 games, could save this one. It was a step backwards for the genre, but the introduction of microtransactions assures it gains a place in history books. One thing you don't see much of is isometric type beat-em-up games, and that is why Moonwalker here on the arcades was one of those rare titles. Moonwalker. Sega had a good relationship with the king of pop in those days and put it to good use. Michael Jackson himself worked on and composed most of the music for the arcade sleeper hit. The game was about Michael Jackson trying to save kids, and you not only got to play as the legend himself, but you got to don a metal armor suit as you took on the bad guys, with the help of your pet chimp, Bubbles. The arcade took a more direct approach to the beat-em-up genre, whereas the Genesis version was more of an action platformer, and if you wanted that extra Michael Jackson touch to it, you had the dancing included in the gameplay as well. The arcade was rare to find in the wild, but luckily, Sega decided to make a Genesis game about the pop icon on the console side as well. They might be radically different, but both of them offer plenty of gameplay fun. SNK took fighting to the next level with Super Spy. Until now we had seen 2D, we had tackled top-down overhead, and belt-scrolling formats for the beat-em-up genre. SNK said, let's bring a little bit of 3D into the mix. This one here, however, was not true 3D of course, but had the feel of performing that feat. And during the early 90s, that was a big change of pace. It was really great considering the hardware limitations of the new 16-bit machines and arcades. The graphics were very colorful and the sprites were big and detailed. It was a nice change to the traditional 2D beat-em-ups during the early days of the 90s.
Hey, come on! Hey, come on!
Now, Taito was no stranger to the beat-em-up genre, and they brought Growl to the arcades that year. You got to choose from 4 different characters, all with different stats, as you took on poachers who are encroaching upon your land. This one wasn't a huge hit in the arcades, but it did get a Genesis port. It was also one of the first times that game developers decided to tackle a subject such as poaching in a video game. It was a bit different too, since the levels not only went side to side, but had you traversing up and down as well. It's a beat 'em up that you wouldn't guess from watching this clip. You start off using missile launchers on your enemies right from the start. This game had you picking up all sorts of weapons at all times. We're talking whips, guns, grenades, metal bars, you name it. The game was also very bloody and violent, just tons of body parts flying everywhere. Another cool thing that this game had is that the characters actually talked.
Hey, stop it! Who do you think you are?
This is one of those hidden arcade gems, if you can find it. And if you can, play it. But if pop stars and microtransactions were not your thing, don't worry. This was just the start of the new decade. We got plenty more.
Commercial break.
Now let's move on to 1991. Konami, back in those days in the arcades, could do no wrong. They were nearly invincible and untouchable. They brought us another kick-ass hit with Vendetta, the sequel to Crime Fighters from a few years back, although the game was never officially marketed as a sequel to that game. They had spruced up the graphics, actually made the players look a bit different from one another, and did away with the number health bar option and decided to go with health bars for this one. It was 4-player co-op as well, and just like Crime Fighters, this one also never got a home port release, which was a shame since the game was very colorful and lots of fun to play. Play this one if you can get your hands on it. It's another one of those little known arcade gems. Data East somehow always knew how to hit that right note in the arcades, and in 1991 They treated us to a fun, superhero brawler with the release of Captain America and the Avengers. This cabinet came in two versions, a 4-player and a 2-player cabinet. The only setback with the 4-player cabinet is that you were stuck with certain characters based on what position you played at. So if you like to play as Hawkeye, for example, you were always stuck at the end of the right side of the cabinet. Not exactly the best idea in terms of cabinet design, but luckily the gameplay was awesome. The graphics were great and had a cool comic feel to them. If you were a comic geek back then, like me, or just like brawlers, this game was heaven sent. Data East knew it had a winner on their hands and ported this one to the Super NES, Game Gear, Game Boy, and Genesis so that everyone could enjoy this comic-themed beat-em-up.
Don't disturb us. No! Fine! Fine! Fine!
Sega, in the meantime, had been creating a beat-em-up for the Genesis that would rival arcade counterparts. They needed a hit on their console side that would stand against the best of the beat-em-ups in the arcade side. They got their game in Streets of Rage. Magazine ads showcased the abundance of fighting moves this game had. It was a game changer on the console side. I mean, sure, there had been many fighting games before it, but this one was different. It did for 16-bit consoles what Double Dragon had done back in the arcades and the original Nintendo. It had awesome controls, as great of gameplay as you can ask of any game, and one hell of a freaking amazing soundtrack courtesy of the great Yuzo Koshiro. He was inspired by techno electronic music, and the feel of the soundtrack of this game matched that. This soundtrack here can cost you a pretty penny on the Japanese market. The overall sound effects for the game were crisp too. You had 3 characters to pick from, all who were cops. Why not just call the rest of the cops to help you out at that point? Who knows? It turned out actually you could, but only from time to time. This is the only game in the series where your special move was able to call on the cop car that clears out all the enemies on the screen with a missile strike. The bosses were great too, and nothing to sneeze at either. Sega finally had their beat-em-up Grand Slam. Now here's a little known arcade that is actually pretty good.
Spiderman
Arcade was also made by Sega and it ran on the System 32 board. This game lets you play as 4 characters: Spider-Man, Black Cat, Hawkeye, and Submariner. This arcade brought a new aspect into the beat-em-up genre. This game would start off as any regular beat-em-up, but at certain points in the game, the camera zoomed out and gave you a more detailed look at the level, and at the same time became a platformer, requiring you to jump and maneuver your way to the end of the level.
Venom has to be stopped.
Eventually, the screen would revert back to its original format. This feature was unique to this game, outside of Neo Geo titles of course. And why is it Spider-Man has a dad bod? Venom's a little chunky here too. And what happened to Submariner's legs? The sounds are good, but the music was nothing out of this world. Regardless of all those things I just pointed out, this game actually is fun. Try it out. The 4-player cabinets were all the rage back then, with the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles being one of the most popular in those days. Konami delivered again with a great 4-player cabinet when they released The Simpsons. Simpsonmania was at an all-time high during the early 90s. They were everywhere, so it was no surprise that they got an arcade game, but I don't think anyone anticipated how good it would be. The graphics were very cartoony and perfectly mirrored the cartoon. You could choose from any of the Simpson family members except for Maggie, since she is the one that's kidnapped by Smithers at the beginning. This game had you traveling through all of Springfield, and as you did, you kept coming across many characters from the show, and you even got a chance to play some mini games in between the levels.
Blow up your balloon. Ready? Go!
One of the interesting things about this game was that you could team up with another player to deal extra damage. This is one of the few times in a beat 'em up where you can use your ally as a weapon as well, in true co-op fashion of course. The game featured the feel of the show with perfection. Konami had once again hit a home run.
Up and at 'em!
But we can't leave 1991 and not give a quick heads up to these games here. '91 turned out to be a very busy year. The beat-em-up train was in full effect, but would it sustain its speed? Hold on tight, cause 1992 would be even more jam-packed with awesome arcade and console hits. Sega released a pretty cool looking beat 'em up called Arabian Fight in the arcades in this year. This title also ran on the same system board as the Spiderman Arcade. This title had some cool animation effects showing the enemy characters jumping into the screen from the front, side, and even above you. Sega was really pushing the envelope with the graphics on this one. The controls and the gameplay on this one were not that great, but the animation and the huge fights are what really set this one apart. It never got a port outside of the arcades, and that's a shame too. Irem returned to the beat-em-up category with Undercover Cops. One of the things that stood out with this one is the great attention to details in the graphics. You got the choice of selecting from 3 characters, Claude, Baba, and Flame. Wait, Flame, Blaze, no, I thought I had something there. Anyway, You got to fight across a wasteland, fighting mutant creatures and other bizarre looking enemies. You could pick up a bunch of stuff to use as weapons. Some were silly, some were not. Another unique feature with this one is that you didn't just pick up food items to restore health. You could also eat vermin that are running around the levels to regain health. Critters as food. Think about that.
Rat. This is a rat burger. Not bad.
A really interesting beat 'em up with some sick graphics. Cool little trivia is that many of the people that worked on this game right here went on to form the Nazca Corporation, which created the Metal Slug games on the Neo Geo. This game also spawned a few sequels and a manga in Japan. Now, digitized graphics were not entirely new at that time, but they were quickly gaining popularity. The next game here looked to capitalize on that fame. Guardians of the Hood had two distinctions going for it when it was released in the arcade. First, it had one of the silliest names possible for a beat 'em up, and two, it had digitized graphics, one of the first seen in a belt-scrolling beat 'em up. It was developed by Atari after their success with Pit Fighter back in 1990. You got to choose from 4 characters and 3 players could play at the same time. This game not only had digitized graphics but scaling effects that looked pretty good for that time but choppy overall. Another unique feature with this title is that after you defeated a boss, he joined your cause and he became a selectable character from that point on. The animation is very choppy, as is the gameplay, but Atari was trying something new here and I have to give them props for that. Unfortunately, this is an example that clearly cements the idea that graphics are not always everything.
What else we doing out on the stage? We meet to rock the beat. It's a known fact. We're hitting.
B-Rap Boys was an arcade game by Kaneko and a sequel to the arcade game DJ Boy, which was released in 1989. The first one had you beating up enemies on roller skates, and the sequel had you fighting them on a bike, a skateboard, or roller skates. This has got to be the only time a bike has been used as a weapon in a beat 'em up. The intro alone is a real silly spectacle. The soundtrack of this game is made up of rap tunes, and it's one of the first games to have a fully licensed soundtrack. Another thing setting it apart from other beat 'em ups. The tracks were recorded by 3 Stories High and taken from their album titled Famous Last Words, which was released in 1991. You got to choose from 3 different characters with no names, but they didn't need any names, not with such a bumping soundtrack. And the levels were also insane. One moment you were fighting on the streets, the next you were suited up on a mech, fighting other mech robots, or even fighting a lion. This game was all over the place. Play it, if only to hear the awesome soundtrack. We had seen so many variations of beat 'em ups since it was introduced in 1984, so how did you separate yourself from the pack? Taito gave it a shot with Kickmaster on the Nintendo Entertainment System. This game let you control a character that only had kick in his arsenal. Another interesting aspect of this game is that you leveled up, allowing you to upgrade your magic points and learn new kick moves. The entire game had a Castlevania vibe to it and cutscenes similar to that of Ninja Gaiden. Taito really started to up their game towards the end of the life of the Nintendo Entertainment System. The colors and details on this game were some of the best the NES had to offer in its final days. Sega in the meantime had been tweaking and upgrading their sequel to their Streets of Rage game. Part 2 was heralded as a worthy successor and an evolution to the genre in terms of gameplay, controls, and graphics. Everything from Part 1 was magnified. Now you had 4 characters to choose from. Adam from Part 1 was gone and was replaced by Max and Skate, who is Adam's younger brother. Each player controlled slightly different and had their own set of moves. Also gone was the ability to summon the police car. Now, each one had a special move that depleted their health bar each time that you used it. The soundtrack was once again composed by the amazing Yuzo Koshiro. And if you thought Part 1 had a great soundtrack, Part 2 just took it to another level. And speaking of levels, they were varied and very colorful. This one is one of the great Genesis classics. Sega had delivered a home run with Part 1, and somehow managed to upstage the game with this one here. But before we leave 1992, here are some other great beat-em-ups.
The Sega Genesis has blast processing. Super Nintendo doesn't. So what's blast processing do? And what if you don't have blast processing?
Splatterhouse brought a horror theme to the beat-em-up back in 1988 when it was released. Night Slashers here, developed by Data East, brought it to the next level. You had 3 characters to choose from, each with special moves that are capable of clearing full screen of enemies. The horror atmosphere and enemies made this one a very fun ride. You fought zombies, bats, demons, werewolves. If it's supernatural, it's most likely in this game. The graphics on the enemies and the levels overall were very colorful. If for some reason you missed out on this one and couldn't play it back then, no worries. Luckily it was re-released on Steam and the Nintendo Switch. Better yet, a remake has been planned by Forever Entertainment for all consoles. Go play it if you can, it's a great game and a perfect way to kill some time. Now, if Night Slashers took horror theme beat-em-ups to the next level, this next game here just took the beat-em-up genre as a whole to insane new levels. Ninja Baseball Batman, made by Irem. let you take control of 4 characters tasked with the mission of recovering stolen artifacts that belong to the Baseball Hall of Fame. You travel throughout the United States in search of them as you battle it out with what I consider to be the most wacky and insane characters ever put in a beat 'em up game, or video games in general. The players had plenty of fighting moves that could be performed by specific joystick movements and button combinations. The graphics, as with all Iron games, were very detailed and very colorful. Unfortunately, this one never made it out of the arcades. It would have been so awesome to see this game ported to the PlayStation or the Saturn back in the day. But thanks to emulation and ROM conservation, this title was not lost to time and gained a huge following on the retro MAME community. This one here is a true definition of an arcade sleeper hit. Cadillac and Dinosaurs was released by Capcom to coincide with the animated show of the same name, released that same year. Both the game and the animated show were based on the comic book series Xenos, I don't know how to pronounce that. This game lets you choose from 4 characters, and 3 players could play together at the same time. The dinosaurs in the game were for the most part neutral and can harm you as well as enemies nearby. The team attack concept found in the Simpsons arcade game could also be found here. You got to battle your way through 8 colorful stages filled with not only enemies, but dinosaurs of course. The sound effects are crisp and the music is exactly what you would have expected out of a Capcom game. I'm not familiar with the comic book or animated show, but knowing Capcom, I got a good feeling this arcade did it justice. Now, what if we took the concept of Altered Beast, broke it out of its 2D plane, and kicked it up a notch? We got Metamorphic Force, one of the last Konami beat-em-ups they would ever produce. This arcade had 2-player and 4-player cabinet setup. You got to choose from 4 characters who can transform into different types of beasts: a bear, a wolf, a tiger, and a minotaur. Except for the beginning of the game, in each stage, you would spend most of your time in animal form. You could collect golden statues, which sometimes gave you temporary power-ups or just improved your health. You had 6 overall stages in the game that were broken up by bonus stages. It also borrowed the idea of having certain NPCs run into the screen that could give you items if the player hit them, as in Golden Axe. The soundtrack in this game was awesome. It had a great rock and roll vibe to it, and the gameplay was fast and frantic. Play this one if you ever get the chance.
I won't let anyone step in this area!
Namco had introduced the horror theme to the beat-em-ups back in '88. Data East took the idea and brought it to a whole new level of fun. Now it was Namco's turn again, so what did they do? They decided to reimagine their Splatterhouse franchise and breathe new life into it on the Sega Genesis. Splatterhouse 3 was nothing like the first 2. You were no longer tied down in a 2D plane. It was set now in a belt scrolling format. You could wander through the mansion rooms as you made your way to the main boss for that specific floor. You could power up yourself for a short amount of time by collecting enough orbs to help you advance, but since it's only temporary, you have to strategize as to when to power up. Some rooms were just more difficult than others, so it took some memorization to determine what was the best path and when was the best time to use that power up. It was a nice change of pace for the beat 'em up genre, and one that was somewhat unique when it was released. It wasn't easy either. Alongside Metamorphic Force, Violent Storm here was the last beat 'em up for that amazing arcade run Konami had in the late 80s and early 90s. During this time, they went on to create some of the most cherished and memorable arcade game and cabinets that are cherished and collected to this very day. Now of course this wouldn't be their last arcade, but their last beat 'em up arcade game. It had really large character sprites and colorful graphics overall. It wasn't revolutionary or even popular for its time, but it is Konami's swan song for this genre. And so with this game, we bid a farewell to Konami on the beat 'em up genre. Thanks guys.
Sprites can be rotated, scaled, morphed, faded, transparent, and overlaid. Multiple sprites can be joined together to allow sophisticated multi-plane scrolling effects to be performed. The PlayStation Custom 3-Dimension.
I wasn't sure how to rank this one. Is it a beat 'em up or a semi-platformer? A little bit of both? One thing is for sure, in a world of beat 'em up games populated by 2D and belt scrolling formats, this one took another unique approach to its presentation. Top Hunter, it incorporated two playing fields to give it somewhat of a 3D feel to it, and was 2-player co-op as well. It had very cartoony and colorful graphics with many wacky looking enemies. And you got to choose from 4 levels on a selection screen similar to that of Galaxy Force. The pacing of the game was fast, but not too fast that it prevented you from enjoying it. You could punch, and you can throw your characters, and you can even ride a mech from time to time and pull levers scattered throughout the levels to open up paths or access bonus items. The action was mixed with bonus levels in between as well, and in them you could find yourself riding a skateboard and collecting gems for points. It was a nice change of pace to the traditional beat 'em up, and overall a nice addition to the Neo Geo library. Capcom have been doing arcade beat 'em ups now and slashers for the past few years, but in 1994 it released 2 amazing titles. The first one here is Alien vs Predator, and it is considered by many to be one of the top beat 'em ups of all time. It was originally made to coincide with the Alien vs Predator movie that was never completed. You got to choose from 4 characters, a Predator warrior and a hunter, and a male and female cyborgs. Does the male look familiar? Of course he does. He was supposed to be modeled after Arnold Schwarzenegger. Some cabinets let you play 3 players at once, or you also had 2-player cabinets. Characters had melee attacks, but you could also use your guns. You just had to keep an eye on your ammo. The graphics were top notch for that time, and the action fast paced. The 32X almost got a port of this arcade. That would have helped it.
I got it. I got it. Crap. I got it.
Battletoads for the NES came out in 1991, and Rare decided to release an arcade version 3 years after the console release. Even though Battletoads never really took off the way the Turtles did, this arcade game is a great beat 'em up with really eye-popping graphics and good gameplay. You got to choose from all 3 Toads, and the arcade is the only Battletoads game to offer 3-player co-op. The graphics were very large and colorful, and Rare used most of the technology for this game when they made Donkey Kong Country for the Super Nintendo. The arcade bombed big time, and the Battletoad brand was shelved for 26 years before it was revived in 2020. This arcade was rare back then. We had gone through many variations of beat 'em ups until this point. Capcom added one more twist to that genre, a beat 'em up with mechs. This game right here is Armored Warriors. You got to pick from 4 different pilots and their mechs, and up to 3 players could play simultaneously. The mechs are large and well animated for sprites, and it's cool how they kept size differential to properly match the contrast between the mechs and the smaller sized people. The arcade for some reason didn't do very well, but it did spawn a spin-off with Cyberbots, which was released in the near future. There aren't many beat 'em up mech games out there, so if you can somehow find this one or get your hands on it, play it. So I will end this video on 1994 and continue off with the remainder of the 90s on my next video. The early 90s saw many new innovations to the beat 'em up arcades, and on the console side as well. Graphics were not the only improvement. While some changes were for the good, like 3 and 4 player co-ops taking center stage, others like microtransactions in Double Dragon 3 was not. SNK brought a 3D feel to the genre with Super Spy. Sega gave Moonwalker a unique point of view, while Kaneko allowed you to use a bike to fight enemies while rocking to a crazy, fully licensed rap soundtrack. Namco evolved the Splatterhouse series beyond a 2D plane to give the beat 'em up a more explorational feel to the genre while keeping its horror theme intact. This right here was just the first part of the 90s. The beat 'em up genre had managed to stay relevant at a time when the one-on-one fighting genre was really blowing up with the introduction of Street Fighter II in the arcades. The growing popularity of that genre started to invade into the arcade space of the beat 'em up cabinets. We got to see those cabinets slowly take up more and more real estate in local arcades across the country, and game developers knew this. Konami was one of the few to release their last 2 beat 'em ups in 1994. Others would soon follow. So what could the rest of the 90s provide? The herd was thinning, but there was still a little bit more of innovation to squeeze out of the beat 'em up genre. So stay tuned for my next video to find out what they were and how the millennium would end for this genre. Until then, take care of yourselves.